Jesus had a group of 12 closest disciples and dozens of other followers who accompanied him throughout his earthly ministry. But curiously, it was an unlikely disciple, who followed him in secret for fear of the Jews, who in the end, at the most critical and decisive moment, showed a courage that all the others lacked. To give you an idea, while the great apostle Peter denied Jesus, this secret disciple opposed the entire court that had gathered to condemn the Son of God. And when the other disciples abandoned Jesus on the cross, this secret disciple risked himself before the Roman governor of the province to ask for Jesus' body so that he could be given a proper burial. This secret disciple was Joseph of Arimathea, someone who did not emerge from the anonymity of history because of his social status or his prestigious position as part of the Jewish Sanhedrin of the 1st century. But because of the way he overcame his fears and internal conflicts, he became part of the fulfillment of the scriptures by carrying out certain details of God's eternal plan. But while Christians see Joseph of Arimathea as the remarkable person who conferred one final honor on the body of Jesus Christ, some critics see him as the key player in the plot of the resurrection story, attributing to him the responsibility for having disappeared with Jesus' body so that the resurrection story would spread. On the other hand, in several ancient legends, Joseph of Arimathea is also portrayed as the guardian or bearer of the Holy Grail and also as one of the founders of the Church in the region of present-day England. But does it all make sense? In this video, you will understand who Joseph of Arimathea really was and what he did when he removed Jesus' body from the cross. To understand the importance of Joseph of Arimathea and why he became known as Jesus' secret disciple, it is first necessary to place him in the broad context of the 1st century, a period in which Judea was under Roman occupation. Political, religious and social tensions permeated relations between Jews and Roman authorities, especially in Jerusalem, the religious center of the Jewish community and the site of the temple. The evangelists record throughout their writings that this period was marked by messianic fervor, in which many Jews awaited the coming of a liberating Messiah. In addition, Israel's religious leadership was primarily concentrated in the Sanhedrin, the supreme council of elders that decided legislative and religious matters, led in part by the high priests and scribes. This council had civil and religious jurisdiction, although it was limited by the Roman government in matters of greater gravity, such as the application of capital punishment. It was in this environment that Joseph of Arimathea lived and worked. The Sanhedrin, made up of around 70 members, included Sadducees, Pharisees and respected elders of the people. According to the Gospel accounts, Joseph of Arimathea was a distinguished member of this council. Among the most influential political and religious groups of the time were the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Zealots and the Essenes. The Pharisees were keepers of the law and oral traditions. Nicodemus, for example, the one who had difficulty understanding the concept of the new birth, was also a Pharisee and a member of the Sanhedrin, and would become another secret disciple of Jesus. The Sadducees generally belonged to the wealthier classes and were linked to the temple. They rejected certain oral traditions and did not believe in the resurrection of the dead. The Zealots were a revolutionary group who advocated armed struggle against Roman occupation. Finally, the Exeniums were the community that lived in more isolated regions, associated with ascetic practices and strict purity rituals. Joseph of Arimathea, therefore, found himself in the religious political environment of the Sanhedrin, but biblical tradition does not specify whether he was a Sadducee, a Pharisee or some other kind of leader. We only know that he was respected among the Jews, had a certain amount of purchasing power, and had privileged access to the most influential leaders of the time. The exact origin of Joseph of Arimathea is also a point of interest. The word Arimathea was not Joseph's surname, but a reference to his place of origin. The city of Arimathea mentioned in the Gospels has no absolutely confirmed location, although some scholars have suggested that it may be associated with the ancient Hamathan Zophim linked to the territory of Ephraim, a place traditionally referred to as Hama, north of Jerusalem. Although the archaeological identification is uncertain, the mention of the self-name Arimathea functions as historical data that lends credibility to the narrative, as it demonstrates the biblical author's concern to place Joseph in a real place. The Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke and the fourth Gospel, John, provide complementary information about Joseph of Arimathea. Matthew presents Joseph as a rich man who went to Pilate to ask for Jesus' body and buried him in his own tomb hewn out of the rock. Mark points out that Joseph was a respected member of the Sanhedrin who was waiting for the kingdom of God and mustered up the courage to ask Pilate for Jesus' body. Luke makes it clear that Joseph was a good and just man who had not consented to the Sanhedrin's decision to condemn Jesus. John shows Joseph of Arimathea as a disciple of Jesus, but in secret for fear of the Jews, and tells of his partnership with Nicodemus, who brought spices for the embalming of Christ's body. The convergence of these accounts, albeit with slight narrative variations, reinforces the importance of Joseph of Arimathea. The unanimous mention of his name in the four Gospels is internal evidence of solid testimony about him. It is also worth highlighting the fact that, at the time, it would have been unlikely to mention someone's name if there was no consistent historical knowledge to confirm it, as such a mention could easily be refuted by contemporaries. As we've already mentioned, the Gospel of John, in chapter 19 and verse 38, describes Joseph as a secret disciple. But why would Joseph of Arimathea be afraid to come out publicly as a follower of Jesus? Many scholars suggest that opposition to Jesus' message in the Sanhedrin, especially among some scribes, Sadducees and Pharisees opposed to the Master, could jeopardize the position, reputation and in extreme cases even the safety of anyone who dared to openly defend the Lord Jesus. Therefore, the fear that Joseph of Arimathea felt, and which made him become a secret disciple of Jesus, was related to the possibility that, if discovered, the other members of the Sanhedrin would expel him from the council and even from the synagogue. However, Joseph's decision immediately after Jesus' death indicates a courageous change of attitude. Crucifixion was a penalty reserved especially for the worst criminals. The Romans used to leave the bodies exposed as a way of demonstrating Rome's power and discouraging uprisings and revolts. However, because it was the eve of a major Sabbath, in this case the Jewish Passover, the Jewish authorities probably preferred the bodies to be removed to avoid ceremonial contamination. It was in this context that Joseph, following this need not to leave the body hanging during the Sabbath, asked Pilate to grant him the right to remove and bury Jesus. This request required influence and courage, because it meant publicly acknowledging a connection with the crucified Christ. Even for the evangelist Mark, Joseph dared to address Pilate. The Greek word used for courage suggests that this was a moment of risk and determination. The act of asking for the body not only attested to Joseph's social status, someone with access to the Roman governor, but also confirmed his alignment with Jesus' cause. He took it upon himself to pay the Master the ultimate honor, allocating his own private tomb for this purpose. Then, after proving that Jesus really was dead, Pilate gave Joseph of Arimathea permission to bury him. Joseph and others went to Calvary so that they could remove the body from the cross. Although he died as a malefactor, Condemned by the Romans under pressure from the Jewish authorities, in the end Jesus was buried in a dignified manner, in a place that was certainly not intended for common criminals. The form of burial mentioned in the Gospels, a tomb dug into the rock with a large stone to close the entrance, is compatible with Jewish practice at the time. Archaeological remains of 1st-century tombs located around Jerusalem indicate that wealthy or more prestigious families had caves carved into the rock, where several bodies could be deposited in openings or on stone benches. In fact, archaeologists confirm the existence of tombs from this period with large circular stones, or even rectangular stones that were placed to seal the entrance to the grave. For many interpreters, this aspect has some apologetic value, as it indicates that the narrative reflects real customs and not a later invention. If the authors of the Gospels had wanted to fabricate details, the archaeological accuracy would not have been so evident. Joseph of Arimathea may have acquired or prepared this tomb for his own family. However, the biblical text says that the tomb had not been used until then, so it was a suitable place to receive a body that would not suffer decomposition. This apparent detail, the provision of a new tomb, hewn out of the rock, became an essential part of the narrative of faith and the proclamation of the gospel, because when the women went to the empty tomb, they could clearly see that no one was lying there. There was no confusion about which body or which place, since the tomb was owned by someone of renown, and Jesus' body had been placed there alone. In God's sovereign plan, the smallest details were taken care of, creating the perfect historical conditions for the announcement of the resurrection on the third day. In addition, the fact that the tomb had been provided by Joseph of Arimathea clearly reminds us of what was prophesied by the prophet Isaiah, that the suffering servant would be with the rich man at his death. In the task of preparing the body, Joseph had the help of another member of the Sanhedrin, Nicodemus, who provided the spices used to anoint Jesus' body, while Joseph prepared the fine linen. It's worth noting here that the Jews prepared their dead differently from the Egyptians. While the Egyptians embalmed their dead by removing internal organs, the Jews wrapped the fine linen around the body in a kind of bandage and spread the spices, such as a mixture of myrrh and aloe, over the body. One people's great curiosity has to do with the location of the tomb provided by Joseph of Arimathea. Despite much speculation about this, nothing concrete is known. In fact, this difficulty arises from the fact that it is not known exactly where Calvary was. And this is problematic because all we know is that the tomb was in the vicinity of Calvary. Today in Jerusalem, some tourist sites are identified as being the original locations described in the biblical accounts, but nothing can be proven exactly. The so-called Holy Sepulchre, revered by Christian tradition since at least the 4th century, is considered by many to be the plausible site of Jesus' crucifixion and burial. Others suggest alternatives such as the Garden Tomb, discovered in the 19th century, mainly by Protestant missionaries. For all these reasons, many scholars argue that the original location of the tomb in which Jesus was buried is impossible to determine. It's probably for the best. After all, the important thing is not to know the location of the tomb prepared by Joseph of Arimathea, but the certainty that Jesus Christ is no longer in it. Although references to Joseph of Arimathea are concentrated in the Gospels, some late traditions emerged about him, especially in apocryphal literature and medieval legends. One of these, widespread in the Middle Ages, linked Joseph of Arimathea to Brittany, portraying him as a great merchant who owned a fleet of ships that exported between the Roman province of Palestine and Brittany. According to these accounts, Joseph of Arimathea was supposedly imprisoned when he was blamed for the disappearance of Jesus' body, abandoned by his family and had his property confiscated. Then, after 13 years in prison, he was released by Tiberius Alexander, governor of Judea. In freedom, Joseph would have been able to rebuild his fortune and would have invested his resources in the work of evangelization. According to these legends, Joseph of Arimathea founded the first Christian congregation in Britannia when he was sent there by Philip of Gaul in 63 AD. Variations of these legends also tell how Joseph of Arimathea supposedly took the Holy Grail to Glastonbury, in present-day England. However, there is no solid historical evidence to support these legends. Most historians and theologians recognize that these accounts are nothing more than legendary additions, perhaps created for apologetic or devotional reasons in the medieval tradition. In any case, from a biblical and historical point of view, Joseph of Arimathea is an important figure in the account of Jesus' burial. The emphasis of the biblical record is not on Joseph's later adventures, but on his decision to reveal himself as a disciple of Christ at a time when the majority, including the apostles themselves, were scattered. Critics who question the historicity of Joseph of Arimathea, on the other hand, claim that his mention in the Gospels could be the result of a late addition, to reinforce the belief in the resurrection and fulfill the prophecy of Isaiah 53. However, this hypothesis faces objections. Firstly, oral and written traditions circulated rapidly, and opponents of early Christianity could refute false information about someone who was supposedly a member of the Sanhedrin. Secondly, Mark's Gospel, considered by most theologians to be the oldest Gospel, already includes Joseph of Arimathea in its narrative, which indicates that the story was known and accepted in early Christian circles. Furthermore, for many scholars, the presence of Joseph of Arimathea in the narrative of the four Gospels is precisely one of the indications of the historical credibility of the account of Jesus' burial. The multiplicity of testimonies and the convergence of details, such as Joseph being a member of the Sanhedrin, the possession of a new tomb and the courage to ask Pilate for the body, suggest that this is a very early tradition. It is worth remembering that the inclusion of specific names was common in ancient historiography in order to legitimize the events described. If these names were fictitious, any contemporary person could easily dispute the veracity of the story. And it really wouldn't make sense to invent a false story involving an influential member of the Sanhedrin, which was the same council that had condemned Jesus, if that story could be easily disproved by the Jewish authorities of that period. As for the idea that Joseph of Arimathea supposedly took over Jesus' body to justify the resurrection story, this is also indefensible. If Joseph's historical existence is completely plausible, it wouldn't make any sense that a member of the Jewish Sanhedrin would risk everything he had, including his own life, to take over the body of someone who was killed in the most undignified way of the time, and all just to start a rumor that the condemned man had risen. This is totally illogical. Someone of Joseph of Arimathea's importance, who had so much to lose, would only do what he did if he was really sure of who Jesus Christ really was. People who took risks, who lost what they had, who gave up their lives, truly believed that Jesus Christ was the Son of God, and they died not for the popularity of a lie, but for the defense of a truth. So Joseph of Arimathea was someone who, even though he was a secret disciple of Jesus, was part of God's eternal designs and took part in the central moments of the history of the Christian faith. All the great Christian confessions and catechisms emphasize the biblical doctrine that Christ truly suffered and was buried. In fact, the gospel consists not only of Christ's death and resurrection, but also of his burial, proving that his death was real. Jesus Christ didn't just look dead, he truly succumbed to death, And Joseph of Arimathea was a witness and participant in this crucial moment of the humiliation of the Son of God that preceded his future exaltation. In this sense, Joseph of Arimathea exemplifies divine providence, which uses specific people at critical moments in the redemptive plan. Even someone who kept silent out of fear, at the right moment served as God's instrument so that the scriptures would be fulfilled. It's really interesting to think that Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, two members of the Sanhedrin who were improbably following Jesus secretly, were courageous and showed themselves present at the time when almost all of Jesus' public disciples disappeared and even denied him. Without a doubt, one of Joseph of Arimathea's greatest legacies lies in his example of courage. For the Christian faith, Joseph of Arimathea remains a symbol of a disciple who, even though it was secret for a time, publicly testified to his commitment to Jesus at a time when all seemed lost. His story shows us that divine grace works even in fearful hearts, awakening acts of fidelity in decisive hours. We can even say that Joseph of Arimathea's legacy is twofold. On the one hand, he shows that eternal security is not based on what man can do, but on the sovereign providence of God, who arranges all things for his glory. On the other hand, he inspires every believer to understand that true faith leads us to courageous action, even if we face external or internal pressures. So, the memory of this secret disciple remains alive to this day in the history of the Church, as a great testimony of faith and love for Christ, reminding us that even in the midst of the most hostile places, God raises up servants to carry out His will. Now write in the comments if you already knew the story of Joseph of Arimathea. Anyway, this was another video for the channel. That's why I'm leaving the link to the audiobook, The Voice from the Inside 7 Chapters to Change Your Life. I'm going to teach you how to absorb knowledge from movies and series and apply it to real life. I'll tell you the secret to using the power of anger to your advantage. Instead of exploding with the stress of everyday life and not letting anger overwhelm you, teach you how to use the power of your mind to get your ideas off paper and into reality. Learn how to overcome anxiety and no longer need a psychologist in your life based on biblical examples. Dominate any negotiation or conversation with the power of communication, and understand the importance of discretion and how it can be useful in both your personal and professional life. Free yourself for a future full of possibilities. Gain power through voice from the inside. Listen now and start your journey of transformation. The link is in the comments. Until the next video, and may Christ bless you all.